Strictly speaking, this isn't a review. I just wanted to chat a bit about something I've been experimenting recently, about Dirac Live room correction along with two bookshelf speakers, the JERN 15H and the Fyne F1-5. One quick note before we continue, I didn't realize this until after I finished the recording, but there are some audio issues in the video. I normally record with a Nord NT1, but this one was filmed at home, so I use a different mic. The one that looks like something you'd see in a World War II speech. I also had the gain set a bit too high, so the audio quality is kind of poor in some places. Apologize for that. Let's start with the MiniDSP SHD Studio. So, what exactly is this thing? Or perhaps more importantly, why did I ended up buying one in the first place? Well, the story actually starts with the JERN 15H. The JERN has a very obvious characteristic. Its bass is incredibly light, but there's just no much of it. The sub-bass, or to say the bass overall, doesn't have a strong sense of presence. So I started looking into adding a subwoofer, and that's where I ran into a problem. My deck, the Link Select, doesn't have a dedicated subwoofer output. Neither does my amplifier. Without a sub-out, there was simply no straightforward way to feed a separate signal into an active subwoofer. So at that point, the whole plan basically came to a halt. Later on, I brought this up with a friend of mine. He looked at me and said, "Why don't you just add a digital crossover?" And I was like, wait, you're right. If the crossover can split the digital signal into two separated digital outputs, then all I need is one deck for the main system and another deck feeding the subwoofer. Problem solved. So I went ahead and bought a MiniDSP SHD Studio. In simple terms, the SHD Studio is kind of an all-in-one digital Swiss Army knife. It's a digital preamp, a network streamer, a Dirac Live room correction processor, and a 4-channel digital crossover. And it also gives you parametric EQ, delay, and DSP processing. It basically does everything. On top of that, its streaming functionality is surprisingly good. It is room ready out of the box. And if you really want to, you can even flash Volumio onto it. Although I bricked a Metron Ember years ago trying to install Volumio, so I was like, okay, maybe next time. But anyway, one of the biggest advantages of MiniDSP is that it already comes with Dirac Live. That means you don't have to buy the hardware first, and then spend even more money on a separate Dirac license afterward. And the Dirac Live is, honestly, one of the most important reasons I bought this unit. And what exactly does it do? And more importantly, how do you actually use it? We'll get into that in a bit. The accessories are about as simple as they come. Inside the box, you get the SHD Studio itself, a remote control, and that's pretty much it. Now let's talk about how to actually use the SHD Studio. You'll need companion software. If you buy the unit directly from the MiniDSP, your account is automatically granted access to the software download page. Otherwise, this page will simply be empty. If you bought yours secondhand, don't worry, just send MiniDSP an email and they will usually transfer the software license and download access to your account. And once everything is installed, this is what the software looks like. Let's start with the Dirac Live, because for me, it's one of the most important features of the MiniDSP, or say the SHD Studio. The reason is my listening room. It looks something like this. Over the front right side, there's a door. That means I simply can't place my speaker perfectly centered. Otherwise, the moment someone opens the door, something really bad will happen. Naturally, that creates another problem. The speakers are no longer positioned symmetrically, which means the reflection on the left and right side of the room are completely different. On top of that, there's another door leading to the bathroom on the right. So even when I was installing my acoustic panels, I couldn't make the acoustic treatments perfectly symmetrical as well. And to make things even worse, the room also has a very large bar window. So overall, it's an extremely asymmetrical listening room, which means the room itself has a significant influence on what I'm hearing. That's exactly where the Dirac Live comes in. It's a room correction tool I needed to compensate for those acoustic problems. So let's go through how it actually works. The first step is to install the companion software, then connect your computer to the SHD Studio via USB, and then click Start Calibration. The first time you launch it, it'll ask you to log in. But honestly, whether you sign in or not doesn't really matter. The Dirac Live license is tied to your hardware itself, not your account. So if you don't feel like creating an account, you can simply just hit skip. It doesn't affect the calibration process. Once you are in, you will arrive at the calibration interface. To begin measuring, you will need a microphone, but here is something worth pointing out. Not just any microphone will work. Ideally, you'll want a free-field measurement microphone, and preferably one with reasonably high accuracy. If the calibration file or the microphone isn't accurate enough, you may come through some errors. I actually have two microphones here. The first is BK4938. The second one will probably look very familiar if you ever bought an iLoud MTM. It's the arc measurement microphone that comes bundled with the speaker. Here you can adjust both the microphone gain and the SHD Studio's output level. Just click the little unlock icon here and you can raise the output level. As for the microphone, you don't want the input level to be too high or too low. If the meter starts hitting yellow or even worse, red, you are clipping, which means the measurement is no longer reliable. On the other hand, if the level is too low, your signal to noise ratio suffers, and that hurts measurement accuracy as well. Next, Dirac asks you what kind of listening area you are calibrating. Is it a single fixed listening position or a larger listening area like a sofa? Just choose whichever matches your setup. It will guide you through measuring a series of positions. You can start with the center listening position, then move the microphone above, below, in front, and behind, and to either side. Technically, 5 measurement positions are enough, but honestly, if you have already spent money on this thing, you might as well measure a few more. There's one tip I highly recommend. Save your project frequency. Every few measurement positions, just hit save. Otherwise, if you lose connection to the servers, you will have to start everything from scratch. Ask me how I know. Once all the measurements are finished, you will end up at this screen. This is where you actually design your correction filter. Over here on the left, this handle controls the low frequency curtain. You can also move that starting point. And the reason my bass response looks so impressive here is because I'm running a subwoofer. My setup is effectively a 2.1 channel system. Unlike Dirac Live bass control, which treats the subwoofer as a separate device, standard Dirac Live simply consider the subwoofer to be part of the main speaker system. So before running Dirac, it's a good idea to measure and adjust your subwoofer phase alignment yourself. Another thing worth mentioning is the target curve. In an ideal world, you might think the perfect in-room response should be a perfect flat line. And if you look here, the corrected response in the software also appears perfectly flat. But that's a little misleading. This isn't your actual measured response. It's simply MiniDSP's target curve, the response Dirac is trying to achieve. Its job is to make the measured response follow this target as close as possible, but it doesn't literally reshape your speaker into a perfect straight line like this. That simply isn't possible in the raw listening room. Afterwards, I verified the result using REW, and the actual in-room response after correction ended up something like this. One more thing that's worth mentioning. If you measure your speaker again afterwards using another program like REW, you will probably still see a few peaks and dips in the response. That's completely normal. It's tempting to look at a dip and think, oh, there's a null here. I'll just go back to the Dirac and boost that frequency until it's perfectly flat. But in reality, that's not practical. If you try to force every dip flat, you end up asking the speaker to operate well beyond its natural role. It can lead to excessive EQ boost, higher distortion, and reduced headroom, and perhaps even worse overall performance. And more importantly, not every irregularity in an in-room frequency response can be fixed by EQ. Some are caused by room mode, some are caused by standing waves, and in my case, quite a few come from the room itself simply being highly asymmetrical. The room geometric, speaker placement, door, windows, all of these play a role. If you aggressively flatten one position, there's a good chance you will create even bigger problems somewhere else. Sometimes leaving a small imperfection alone is actually the better solution. From my own experience, if you feel the bass is a little too restrained, you can raise the low frequency target slightly. With a complete flat target curve, bass often end up feeling very weak. On the other hand, if you already suffer from heavy standing wave, or the bass is already too much, you may want to reduce the bass target instead. Either way, just to make sure the correction extends down to the actual limit of your subwoofer. For example, my sub-APT reaches down to around 30Hz, so there's no real need to stretch it all the way down to 10Hz. By the way, Dirac also performs phase correction, which is arguably just as important. A lot of people assume the ideal phase response should be perfectly flat 0-degree line. It isn't. When evaluating the phase behavior of a loudspeaker system, there are really four things that matter. First, the relative phase between the main speaker and the subwoofer needs to be correct around the crossover region. If it's not, you will end up with deep cancellations or unwanted lobbing right where the crossover happens. Second, the left and right channel needs to arrive at your listening position at the same time, or at least in a well-controlled manner. Otherwise, the stereo image starts to render and the center image becomes unstable. Third, you don't want excessive fluctuation in group delay or unnecessary phase rotation. Keeping those under control generally leads to cleaner transients and better defined note edges. And finally, it's preferable for the impulse response to be as controlled as possible. A tighter impulse response usually translates into better and sharper imaging and a cleaner soundstage. What Dirac Live is doing here is essentially mixed phase correction. Rather than only applying amplitude EQ, it also adjusts time alignment, and when necessary, it can even apply polarity inversion as part of the optimization. Just like the frequency response graph, you will also see an ideal target for the phase response here. Again, that's not the measured phase. It's simply the response that Dirac is trying to approach through its optimization. The last thing I want to talk about is the crossover. I saved this for the end because, as I mentioned earlier, if you are running Dirac Live, the main speaker and the subwoofer will be treated as a single system. So there's really no point setting the crossover before you have finished the room correction. The SHD Studio gives you three main crossover filter families: Butterworth, Linkwiz, Riley, and the Bessel. The biggest difference between them is where the cutoff frequency is defined. For Butterworth, the crossover point is at -3 dB. For Linkwiz, is -6 dB. And within each family, you can then choose different crossover slopes, such as 12, 24, or 48 dB per octave. One thing I found particularly interesting is the Bessel. You'll notice that it only offers a 12 dB per octave option. After digging around online, I found some information from Ren, the company that originally designed Bessel crossover implementations. According to them, the defining character of a Bessel filter is that it prioritizes an almost linear phase delay. To put that more simply, the transition through the crossover region tends to sound more neutral and more continuous. However, the trade-off is that Bessel rolls off much more gradually. That means the two drivers overlaps much more around the crossover frequency. Because of that, Bessel usually isn't the first choice for a typical 2.1 speaker and subwoofer system. In theory, a 2.1 setup benefits from a steeper crossover because it minimizes overlap between the main speaker and the subwoofer, reducing interference and making the integration easier. Where Bessel really shines is in a system where both drivers are already excellent on their own, and their natural acoustic rolls off complement each other well. In those situations, the smoother phase behavior of a Bessel crossover allows the handoff between the two drivers to sound noticeably more coherent and more natural. Then there's the Butterworth. Compared to the other option, it's really all about flexibility. You'll notice that it offers the widest range of slope option, giving you a lot more freedom to tailor the crossover to your particular system. Finally, there's the Linkwiz Riley. If you don't want to spend hours experimenting or dive into phase alignment, polarity, time delay, blah blah, then just choose the LR24 and call it a day. The reason is pretty straightforward. In most loudspeaker systems, LR24 tend to produce the flattest acoustic summation around the crossover point. It's also much more forgiving of small setup error. So in most cases, the transition between the main speaker and the subwoofer ends up sounding smoother and more seamless. That's also why it's by far the most widely used crossover alignment today. So in the end, my advice is simple: try them yourself. There's no universal correct answer. Pick the one that sounds the best in your room with your speaker. Now let's talk about the speakers. I'll start with the JERN 15H. At first, I thought the brand was pronounced as JERN, but if you ever play war game Red Dragon or Rainbow Six Siege, you will probably know that the Jaeger isn't pronounced as Jaeger, it's Jaeger. Turns out JERN is pronounced more like JERN. The 15H is essentially an upgraded version of original JERN 15, with the main change being a switch to high Q4 foam golden soft dome tweeter. After doing a bit of digging, I found out something pretty interesting. JERN is actually a supplier of cast iron components for BMW. When they exhibit at ISC 2019, the engineer literally stood there with a hammer to demonstrate the vibration damping capability of the WEEBEST cabinet material. At its core, WEEBEST is proprietary high carbon cast iron. According to JERN, they offer 10 times the resonance damping of wood and 100 times that of aluminum. Although, considering how absurdly heavy this little speaker is, I'm honestly convinced it probably wouldn't resonate much, even if it is made out of the cardboard. Anyway, I figured that if the engineer was this interesting, the speaker he built was probably worth checking out as well. So, I ended up buying it here. In simple terms, this is a speaker with absolutely outstanding upper mids and treble performance, whereas the bass is incredibly tight with relatively little sense of presence. Honestly, its bass has about as much presence as Heihachi Mishima's hairline. The bass impact is very light, especially in subbass. There were honestly moments where I found myself wondering whether that 5.5-inch woofer was even doing anything at all. Then I added a subwoofer. At the same time, I crossed the main speaker over at 85 Hz, letting the sub handle everything below that point, and having the frequency response and phase calibrated by Dirac. Honestly, it was like the speaker let out a huge sign of relief. The entire presentation changed. It almost felt as if the JERN never wanted to reproduce deep bass in the first place. Once I took their responsibility away, it no longer had to struggle with the part it wasn't really particularly good at, and instead, it could devote all of its resources to what it does excel at. And the result was an incredibly refined and resolving mid-range and treble. Vocal image became dramatically cleaner. Articulation, breathing, and the movement of the lips, all of those tiny details suddenly become strikingly obvious. Even the edges of notes felt much sharper and more precisely defined. String instruments and wood percussion also improved dramatically. The texture of a violin bow moving across the string, or the subtle vibration of an acoustic guitar string after it's plucked, become noticeably cleaner and more articulate. They are easier to follow than before. While the upper mids and treble take on an incredibly light and transparent character, there's a sense of effortlessness to the way details are presented. The speaker itself has a fairly neutral and straightforward and slightly cold tonality. There's very little, or I can say even almost non-coloration. That kind of tuning naturally has one major advantage. It tends to sound highly resolving because the timbre is so clean. Small details come through with very little masking. And by that, the Link Select just happened to have a richer and smoother presentation with a touch of warmth. Pairing the two together creates a surprisingly complementary balance. You still get all of the detail the JERN is capable of, but without sounding overly dry or analytical. Instead, the warmth from the selects give the 15-inch a subtle sense of richness and polish, almost like adding a gentle golden glow over its otherwise neutral presentation. Another thing that really stands out about the 15-inch is how fast the treble is. Its transient response is exceptionally clean. Whether it's a guitar pick striking a string or the mullet hitting a xylophone, this initial attack arrived incredibly quickly and with great precision. Rather than stretching every note into a long lingering decade, the 15-inch focuses on the leading edge, the initial burst of energy, the outline of each note, and that crisp, decisive sense of attack. Everything starts and stops with remarkable control. Honestly, I think the JERN 15-inch is a speaker that absolutely deserves a subwoofer. Its native bass, whether we are talking about the quantity, low-end foundation, or overall sense of weight, is simply too limited. If I had to sum up the JERN 15-inch in just a few phrases, that would be pinpoint vocal image, with a sharp note definition and lightning fast transients, and exceptional retrieval of instrument detail. To me, these are the qualities that define what this speaker is all about. Now let's move on to the Fyne F1-5. The first thing I have to say is I absolutely love this flowery red finish. To me, it has so much more energy and personality than the stereotype veneer you'd normally see. Although it looks a bit like... Sonically, the F1-5 is much easier to like than the JERN 15-inch, or perhaps more accurate, it's simply more approachable. It doesn't have the same obvious weakness, and its tuning is much more mainstream. If I had to summarize the F1-5 in just 2 words, that would be stage and musicality. The sense of space is excellent, and while we are talking about it, you may have noticed the little adjustment knob underneath the coaxial driver. For the longest time, I was curious about what that control actually did. So finally measured it. It turns out that fundamentally it raises the gain across a broad portion of the upper mid and treble. Turn it all the way up and you are looking at roughly 3 to 4 decibel of additional energy on average. Vocal become remarkably airy. It's almost as if the extra layer of air forms around the edges of the vocal image, making the singer sound more spacious and ethereal. Instruments change as well. The whole presentation become more vivid, more transparent, and almost seems to breathe. The texture of both strings, the airflow through the woodwind, and the lingering harmonics of a piano all become noticeably easier to perceive. If I'm to describe the JERN 15H as precise, direct, and incisive, then the F1-5 is graceful. It flows more naturally, lingers a little longer, and presents music with a greater sense of ease and elegance. And perhaps more importantly, that presence control doesn't just change the tonal balance, it also changes the sense of space, or more accurately, the spatial structure of the presentation. You don't even have to turn it all the way up. Even at around half the waypoint, you can already hear a noticeable improvement in spatial layering compared to having it fully turned down. The depths become more apparent, and the instrument placement is easier to follow. Some sounds clearly sit in the front, others further back, while a few seem to float slightly higher within the stage. Overall, the F1-5 feels like much more complete and well-rounded tuning. Its bass performance is genuinely impressive. There's plenty of quantity, and each bass note has real physical size and fullness. When the kick drum hits, you don't get a brief impact. There's a gentle bloom afterward, allowing the energy to spread naturally and giving the lower half of the stage a satisfying sense of foundation. So in summary, the JERN 15H is more restrained, analytical of the two. It's clearly focused on information retrieval and detail. The way it reproduces vocal articulation and mid-range neurons is exceptional. You can easily pick out the edges of consonants, subtle changes in breathing, and even the resonance inside the singer's mouth. Images are tightly focused, and the overall presentation feels compact and highly concentrated. It's almost as if the JERN compresses an enormous amount of information into a relatively small and sharply defined image. And the F1-5, on the other hand, is more delicate, more airy, and places much more emphasis on spaciousness and openness. The entire presentation feels lighter, more graceful, and more expansive. Even with both speakers paired with subwoofers, the F1-5 doesn't have quite the same mid-range density as the JERN 15H, so it doesn't feel quite as solid or grounded. But in return, it offers a much stronger sense of air. It sounds lighter, more effortless, and gives you much greater impression of air flowing through the performance. That's what really defines the F1-5 for me.